Since 1994, South Africa has ratified several international human rights treaties. These treaties require that the country would periodically report on the progress that they have made. Now, tonight, we take a review of South Africa's human rights record following the third cycle of the UPR process. That's the Universal Periodic Review process. In 2017, South Africa received 243 recommendations. It accepted 187 of those as adoptions of the UPR outcome. Is our human rights institutional infrastructure still standing? Here to unpack this, I'm joined by PAC Secretary General uphold, Advocate Tshidiso Tipanyana, who's the CEO of the South African Human Rights Commission, human rights activist, Mark Haywood. And you're a part of this conversation tonight on WhatsApp by sending us your questions and comments. 072-110-5584 is the number, or otherwise tweet us tonight at Newzroom 405. If you review the record of South Africa on human rights, how are we doing? How are we standing? Let us know tonight. Good evening, gentlemen, and thank you very much for your time and joining us tonight here on In Focus. Advocate Tipanyana, let's begin with you and just ask that broad question. Is our human rights institutional infrastructure still standing?
Good evening to you and to your viewers. It is standing, but very, very shaky, and actually it's in a very worrying state, as it has been mentioned earlier on, due to massive problems of corruption, looting of state resources, but also, the inability really to manage our state institutions, the problems you are seeing around ESCOM and many others. And we are seeing, therefore, high levels of poverty, unemployment, violence, and also, people are getting quite frustrated. So people also, take the law into their hands. For example, the whole issue around the response to undocumented migrants. So we are really in serious crisis as a country. And if we are not careful, if we don't do anything better, we'll be heading towards a failing state. Yeah. Some people are saying already there, but anyway, I think we're still fighting hard, but we're certainly in serious crisis, more than any ever, since 1994, as far as I'm concerned.
In 2017, around September, the Human Rights Commission was at that meeting where South Africa adopted the 187 recommendations of the UPR outcome. What actions have we taken to improve the human rights situation?
Well, I mean, we're still, passing laws. We are still doing the little we can, the best we can as government. But, as I was saying, when you assess where we are today, clearly many of those recommendations have not been adequately, in fact, that we are still seeing high levels of violence actually worsening. We've had the president today saying that South Africa is still one of the most unequal countries in the world. Inequalities are also increasing, largely because of these problems. We are seeing increasing levels of unemployment and poverty more than 10 years ago. So clearly there are problems.
Mark, we are involved in unique transversal processes like the UPR, where we commit to saying we'll do better, particularly when we look at a legal and general framework of implementation, when we look at some of the civil and political rights of individuals are concerned. Have we gone far enough in as far as that implementation? In fact, do we have a strategic and systemic approach in tackling those issues?
Good evening, Tabo. The answer is simple: no, we don't. We are good at passing laws that respect human rights. We're good at signing covenants that are meant to advance human rights. We're good at lip service to human rights, but we're not good at translating any of those things into the lived realities of people who are poor and disadvantaged and in our poorest communities. It's great to hear President Ramaphosa today recognizing that we are the most unequal country in the world. At least he can't deny that. But he is not doing anything, or he's doing too little to narrow that inequality. In fact, you know, this year's budget, we should remember it was only 2 or 3 weeks ago, cuts spending on health, cuts per capita spending on basic education. It gives money back to rich people, to corporations, thereby further increasing the inequalities, but refuses to consider a basic income grant for the millions and millions of unemployed poor people of working age that exist in our country. I guess my frustration, Thabo, or civil society's frustration, is that there is so much that our government could be doing to address this human rights crisis that Advocate Tipanyani just discussed. It has power. It has a constitutional mandate. It could, for example, be acting to reduce the prices of a basket of essential foodstuffs that are needed to ensure that people have sufficient food. It could, for example, I'll give you something that should be in the news, you know, be making sure that 250 million rand that was given to early childhood development centers 2 years ago by the government, but is still not in the hands of carers, of women and other carers who work in those ECD centers, reaches those people in the next 10 days before the end of this month and before all of that money is lost. So what frustrates us is this lip service combined with an apparent paralysis to do anything about the tragic situation that exists in our communities.
Yeah. Interesting that you say that, because one of the recommendations that were noted by South Africa, there were 243 recommendations, only 187 were accepted. The others were noted, but one of those that were noted was actually this question around exploring the universal basic income grant in the place of the existing social protection scheme. I suppose at the time the government was saying we're still going to think about it. That was in 2017. 2020, they were forced in earnest to think about it. Hence, now we have the 350 social relief of distress grant, but even that not going far enough. What are they thinking about?
Well, I don't know what they're thinking about. I mean, they say that we can't afford it. They say that we need to concentrate on economic growth and development, which of course we do need to concentrate on economic growth and development. But the hunger, the despair, the unemployment is something that exists as you and I are talking to each other, and that is contributing to a failed state. And the government's own research, which has been supported by international organizations like the International Labour Organization, commissioned by the DSTV, published in December last year, has shown that a basic income grant could be introduced around the level of the food poverty level, which I believe is now about 600 rand a month, and could be afforded within our fiscus. So I guess, I mean, you don't have anybody from government here to answer these questions, but it's inexplicable and it is inexcusable at the same time. And we've been talking basic income grant, Thabo, for 25 years. As Advocate Tipanyani, I'm sure, can tell you, it was first mooted back in 97 or 96. Why are we still waiting? The last thing I would say on this is that it's not just this universal peer review that has recommended it. Another committee of the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, has also called on government to look at this social security gap when it comes to unemployed adult people between the ages of 18 and 55, and nothing has been done there. And that is another covenant to which we are a signatory and which we have ratified.
Yeah. Dalapo, you can come in here. What is your assessment of government's record in upholding the basic rights of the citizens of South Africa?
Let me start by saying that much as the PAC, we recognize the importance of human rights. For us, we believe that this day should not be named Human Rights Day. It should remain Sharpeville Day, so that it does not lose its meaning, does not lose the context. Once we erase history of this day and pretend that it is another day which was only meant to fight for human rights. It is incorrect. That's why, as an organization, we advocate that we can have any other day as Human Rights Day except the Sharpeville Langa Day, where people were murdered, particularly in Sharpeville and Langa. Now, responding directly to your question, we hear that South Africa is the most unequal society, but we are not told as to who are the people who are representing the poor. The people who are the poor of the poorest, the section that is being referred to as the most unequal are the Africans. That need to be addressed. And importantly, Africans are not participating in the economy of this country. And as a PAC, we believe that land is the commanding height of the economy. And once we get Africans being having the right to own the land, as it is not the case now, Africans will be able to participate effectively in the economy of this country. Those issues are not addressed. We are having issues being sugar-coated, like as if people would only be able to be happy once they get social grants or basic income grants. We support it. We have no problem with it. But for us, it is not a solution. The solution is that Africans need to participate in the economy. It cannot be that in the inequality that we speak of, the majority of people who are poor are Africans, particularly after the 1994 dispensation. It has proven that it has not assisted the Africans. In fact, it has assisted the previous beneficiaries of the systems. They are the ones who are becoming richer. They are the ones who are controlling the economy. But once we make sure that the land is repossessed, is returned to the Africans, so that they can control the economy, they can be in charge. We believe that some of these problems will be resolved rather than sugar-coating issues with things like basic grant.
Yeah.
More important.
What do you think is blocking the return of the land? I mean, is it the system itself? Is it individuals within the system? What do you think is the thing that is blocking this process from taking place?
It is the system. I must say that those who participated in the CODESA discussions or negotiations, they were sort of shortchanged in understanding the issue of the land to an extent that they now comfortably sit elsewhere, and this issue remains with us, the question of the land, because it cannot be that after 27 years we are still discussing the question of the land having not been resolved. Had it not been the constitution that we are having in this country, this issue of the land should have been resolved. We've seen what Parliament tried to do in the last few months, and that did not fly because it does not address the real problem, which is the return of the land to African people. But I wanted to also touch on another important issue. There's a problem in this country, our education system. Much as we may throw much resources into the education system, it does not address the real needs of the country. That's why we also need to start. Because once we have a generation that cannot create employment for itself, but expect somebody else to create employment, then we have a problem. And that is as a result of the education system that we're having, which is primarily based on the colonial system. So we need to also overhaul our education system so that it can produce people who will be able to participate effectively in the economy. Our current education system is failing.
We'll talk more on that in a moment, but Letibanya, let me bring you back here. The South African Human Rights Commission, particularly at the time, commended the South African government on the work it was doing in as far as the question of hate crimes and hate speech and the bill and the law that they were putting in place. How important is the work of that bill currently, and what actions are we seeing around that bill that are beginning to at least bear the fruits that we want to see? I mean, if we look at the events of the past at least 2-3 months, one would say maybe there's very little that these bills are doing, particularly if you look at the kind of racism that has been emerging from our schools in particular.
No, thanks. Certainly, the issue will need a strong law to address issues of hate crimes. The Constitutional Court has passed 2 judgments recently on what defines what is hate speech. And one hopes that, government will move fast in that regard. However, we also need to realize that hatred is just a manifestation of underlying problems in our country, issues of poverty, social grants, issues of land, issues of education. So, if we were to minimize those problems, we definitely, minimize the problems of hatred. And therefore, as long as we don't address the underlying factors of injustice, inequalities, violence against women, and all these problems, hatred will continue to manifest despite the best laws we can have. So yes, it's good to have the laws, but we need to do more than just passing the laws. As Mike was saying, we can't just specialize in passing laws and institutions without really doing the work. Section 7 of the Constitution is very clear. Government has a responsibility to promote, to fulfill, and protect human rights. And at this point in time, the levels of violence, the levels of poverty, violence against people, and that indicates that government has failed to a large extent in realizing the aspirations of our people in the Bill of Rights of the Constitution.
What's really interesting here is that you are saying government has failed, right? There are some in government today who are saying, no, it's this constitution that is keeping us from carrying out, for example, transformative policy decisions like BBBE and so on and so forth. In fact, I was speaking to the Premier of KwaZulu-Natal in a moment on that. He's calling for a parliamentary democracy more than a constitutional democracy, saying the very same document which you say is transformative and declares itself as committed to inclusion of all is the very document that has been keeping us from seeing a transformation and everyone enjoying economic heights that they should be enjoying.
That's a red herring. The Constitution is a social contract for people. We can amend it if we want. It's 25 years. There is a committee in Parliament which every year allows for submissions on amendments of the Constitution. So, we can have the best Constitution in the world, and I think ours is, but it goes deeper than that. It's how we implement the Constitution. That's where the problem is. So for people to say, well, it's a Constitution, we can always amend the Constitution. If all political parties in Parliament want to amend the Constitution, they can do so. The problem is how we implement the Constitution and give effect to the aspirations of people. So it's just a red herring, with due respect.
Yeah, but if I may chip in.
Yes.
If I may chip in, yes. And I just want to understand this, because for me, it does not make sense, particularly from the advocate. We have often hear this thing that we've got the best laws, we've got the best constitution. The only difficulty is the implementation. Then I ask, what is the yardstick of us determining that this is the best law? Because we can only do that once the law has been implemented and we can see the outcomes of that law. What are the implications of the implementation? Now, how do we arrive at the conclusion that the Constitution is correct? It's just that people are not implementing it. For me, if you are unable to implement a law, that means it is not a good law, because you are there, you are unable to implement it. How do you arrive at such a conclusion that this is a good law, but you cannot be able to implement? That's the difficulty that I normally have with this presupposition that the constitution that we are having is the best in the world and all of that. For me, it does not. Unless if I can be proven that this is what we have done with this constitution and this is the outcome, on the basis of that, we are saying there's nothing wrong with the constitution.
All right.
Thank you.
No, yes. Mark, I saw your hand. Mark, I saw your hand. I'm going to come to you in a moment. All right, the advocate, go for it.
The Constitution is not perfect. It's got flaws like any other instrument. However, it will be interesting if people could say, here is where this Constitution is making it difficult for us to give effect to these rights. Then one could understand that argument. And as I'm saying, that there are political parties in Parliament, all of them. If the Constitution was such a hindrance, they can amend it. Just requires 2/3. The problem is not that. The problem is in our ability, both as government, as people of this country, to make sure that we do give effect to those aspirations in the Bill of Rights. Yeah. That's my position.
Mark?
With due respect.
Mark, you can wait as well.
I agree with that. I agree with Advocate Tipanyani. I think the problem, I would put it as this, is political will. Political will to center governance on advancing poor people's interests and narrowing inequality in this country and ensuring that everybody can live with dignity. You know, Section 25 of the Constitution is not a barrier to land distribution. I heard earlier this week the former Deputy Chief Justice Moseneke complaining in a public speech, why has the government never expropriated any land, used the powers that the Constitution has given it? Because if it had expropriated land, and if a matter to do with land expropriation had been brought to the Constitutional Court, the Constitutional Court would have made it very, very clear that the Constitution is not a barrier to land ownership by poor black people or to redistribution. Just as the Constitution is not a barrier, I mean, we've talked about land for good reason, but I think we should also talk about wealth and wealth inequality in this country. Another problem, and it's related to land, but it's not limited to the land question, is that wealth has not been redistributed since 1994. So the vast majority of poor people, who are also black people in this country, have no wealth at all, nothing, no money, nothing on which to start, nothing from which to build. So why do we not talk about a wealth tax, which is something that has been recommended, by the way, by the Davis Commission on Tax?
Yeah.
The reason we don't do anything is because government seems to be afraid to disturb the status quo that at the moment privileges rich people in this country, rich people, still predominantly white people, but also including some black people as well.
But Mark, let me just jump in here, because we're going to take a break in a moment. Are the beneficiaries of this wealth ready to accept accountability that their privilege is what is putting them where they are, and therefore wealth has got to be distributed? Because, I mean, when people say that, those who enjoy the benefit of wealth stand up and say, well, I mean, it must be distributed on merit, not on color, or something of that nature.
Yeah, but you have to take into account our history in this country. You know, inequality, we talk about it as if it's an abstract thing. Inequality is measured in wealth. Inequality is measured in the vast amounts of money that a small minority of people keep in their bank accounts. That money is rarely actively deployed into society. It's not that we don't have money in this country, it's that we're not using the money that we've had, and that we've allowed this situation to continue. And nobody is talking about taking away all of the wealth of rich people. They're talking about a level of taxation, for example, for a one-off wealth tax, that would not make rich people poor. They would continue to be rich at the end of the day.
They will argue, funny enough, that investment will run out of the country. But we'll come back to that in a moment when we talk a little bit more on that. Right, Mark, I'll get your view on that in a moment. In Focus continues for you. Alpha Bowe, Advocate Sidiso Tipanyane, and Mark Haywood staying on tonight. With conversation tonight, Alpha Bowe of the PAC, Advocate Sidiso Tipanyane, CEO of the South African Human Rights Commission, and human rights activist Mark Haywood. Before the break, of course, Mark, you wanted to quickly weigh in on this question that, well, look, if we tax business a little bit more, people will run out of this country. And then I'm going to get that board to come in here. You're saying we should go ahead, tax them anyway?
Well, yes, I do think so, because I think that what often happens is that investors and ratings agencies and big finance institutions overseas threaten us for doing something that is perfectly reasonable and required, in fact, by our Constitution, and for doing something that actually will be in the long and medium term interests of peace and stability and business in this country. because the levels of inequality are so extreme, the poverty has become so high that our society, as we saw in July last year, is a tinderbox waiting to be exploded, to be set alight. And we will not be a center for any type of investment and business interest if we are a country that witnesses the type of destruction and burning on a larger scale as a result of leaving this pain unattended to. I think business would be better to think, okay, do we accept reform within the rule of law as prescribed and allowed by the Constitution, or do we leave things to get so extreme that people act outside of the law, including potentially what I would call populist political parties who say we're tearing up the rule of the law, we're tearing up the Constitution because it hasn't served the poor, we will just do what we want to do going forward. That will benefit neither rich people nor poor people. So there's a need for some hard thinking and some deep introspection by business and government about how we address these human rights crises that you've asked us to talk about this evening.
Yeah. Tatabo, let's weigh in then on that question. It's being said here that the values of our Constitution are that of human dignity, that of achieving equality and the promotion of human rights and freedoms for all. And therefore, if you look at our Constitution, that is a good law in a sense. The failure is on the politicians to implement what the spirit and the letter of the law says.
Another important point that I want to make before I respond directly to your question is that we hear that there's this inequality and the gap between the rich and the poor is growing every day. But what we are not told as to why is that the case. How is it that the rich are becoming rich? Are they smarter? Are they working harder than the poor? What is it that they are doing differently from any other poor person? The answer is simple. The rich have inherited the system that continues to benefit them now and that benefited them during the apartheid. And that system has to be overhauled and changed. Now, directly answering your question, I heard earlier on that the Constitution, with regard to property laws, there's nothing that stops the government from expropriating the land without compensation, as long as that is reasonable. Who determines that reasonability? I will tell you, it is the courts. How do our people access the courts that are so expensive that we are unable to do it? How do we make sure that if somebody says this is unreasonable expropriation, we then go and say this is reasonable? Where do we get that money to do that? Again, how do I have to justify that when I need my land back, somebody had stolen it? Now I need to be reasonable and give reasons as to how should I get that land, and somebody has to determine as to how the reasonableness of my action. For me, it does not make sense. What is important is that the land belongs to the African people and it should be returned to the African people. And by the land, we not necessarily talk about the crown. We talk about the economy. Now, in this country, we have gold, platinum, and all other mineral resources. Their prices are determined elsewhere, making sure that whoever determines that get richer, get more, there's more gap between the poor and the rich. Now, we don't address those systematic issues.